Hey, so we're back for part 4 of the lecture, and in this part we're going to talk about refugees, asylum seekers, and Islamophobia. So starting off with refugees, a refugee is a person who's been forced to flee their country due to a well-founded fear of persecution, war, or violence, and is unwilling or unable to return because it's no longer safe. And so this fear can be based on a lot of things: their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. And refugees are entitled to international protection under laws like the 1951 Refugee Convention. So I've pulled some data from the UN's kind of authority on refugees and the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees. And so by mid-2025, we can see that globally there were 42.5 million refugees. We can also see that since 2005, that number has increased quite a lot. We can see that that's the same for internally displaced people. So these are individuals who have been basically displaced within the nation state that they live in. So they haven't kind of crossed national borders, but they're displaced nonetheless. And there were 67.8 million of them. And then at the same time, there were 8.4 million asylum seekers who have, attempted to seek asylum in other countries. And I was really struck when I was doing a bit of reading around this topic by the fact that globally 1 in every 70 people will experience displacement of some kind. So whether that is due to persecution, due to violence or outbreak of war, whether it's due to a natural disaster, but nonetheless, the kind of rate at which people are experiencing displacement is really high. So I think it's important to consider that globally this is not a minor issue. It's an issue that implicates an extraordinary number of people. And when we're looking at where are refugees coming from, where are they going, this data is a few years old now, but in terms of where they're originating from, it's unfortunately still the same countries. From Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and as of the last couple of years, Ukraine is added to that. And we can see that that in many cases, aside from Germany and Pakistan here, they're ending up in pretty nearby countries, and this is relatively common. So a lot of refugees end up in neighbouring countries. So we can see this happening in Turkey, Colombia, Uganda. In terms of, I guess, how many refugees come to Australia, from some of our kind of political discussions, particularly during the 2000s and 2010s, you might think that it was quite a lot, but it's actually not that many. So if we look at these figures over the last 120 years or so, we can see, it's gone through obviously kind of peaks and troughs, but in total it's been less than 1 million people that have come to Australia as refugees. And if we compare that to those who have come to Australia through migration pathways, like skilled migration, for instance, and family reunification, it's nowhere near as many. And so in terms of, I guess, some of the kind of debate in Australia, there's a lot of confusion around what asylum seekers and refugees are. What do these terms mean? In what cases are people coming or trying to come to Australia illegally? we have these kind of very loaded often racialized terms such as kind of queue jumpers and boat people following the kind of Tampa incident in the early 2000s. And so Australia is a signatory to the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees and the 1967 UN Protocol on the Status of Refugees, and they define a refugee kind of similarly to the definition that I provided a couple of minutes ago, as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such a fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So, each year the Australian government allocates 13,750 places to refugees under its humanitarian program. And so that's refugees. So if we're thinking about the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker is someone who wishes to be recognised as a refugee and be granted protection under the terms of the 1951 UN Convention. So they're someone who has not legally yet been recognised as a refugee, but is kind of seeking that recognition and seeking the kind of legal protection that can come with that. And so when we're thinking about asylum seekers, the thing that immediately kind of springs to mind is that asylum seekers try to come to Australia by boat and are arriving, via the waterways. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that is only a very small proportion of asylum applicants in Australia. Most of them, arrive via air, come on a plane, and have a valid visa, and then make an application for asylum. So, when we're thinking about why the issue with asylum seekers and kind of boat people has become such a huge political issue, perhaps we can start to draw in some of these concepts from earlier in the lecture around race, ethnicity, racialization, in-groups and out-groups, social closure, and start to think critically around what is it about these this particular kind of group of asylum seekers that has attracted so much political and public attention. So when we look at how asylum seekers have been treated in the Australian context, we have a kind of policy of offshore processing. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but in terms of the kind of history of asylum seeker policy, we can start in the early 90s, 1992. We have mandatory detention introduced for non-Australian citizens who arrive without a visa. And then in 1999, we have temporary protection visas introduced, which can provide a kind of visa category for people in that situation who have a kind of valid fear of or a valid need for protection. And then in the year 2000, there was something of an influx of asylum seekers arriving by boat from the Middle East, and they were primarily held in mandatory detention. And at this time, this was mandatory detention in Australia, but this changed in 2001 with the Pacific Solution. So maybe some of you have heard of this or come across it. So this is the kind of policy by which asylum seekers were no longer put into mandatory detention on mainland Australia and were instead put into kind of Australian-funded detention camps in Pacific Island states, so particularly Papua New Guinea and Nauru. And so in 2007, the Rudd government abolished the Pacific Solution. It maintained mandatory detention, but basically temporarily abolished the kind of offshore processing, but this was very short-lived, and the Gillard government reinstated offshore processing and offshore detention. By 2013, the Abbott government introduces Operation Sovereign Borders to try to stop the boats and to be seen as kind of doing something about people arriving by boat. So this involved kind of intercepting boats at sea and kind of turning them back and telling them to turn around. And then by 2014, the Australian Human Rights Commission demands an inquiry into children in detention, because there's children in mandatory detention at this time, and this comes onto the radar of Human Rights Watch in 2015, which at this time lists Australia as a country to watch for potential human rights breaches due to the policy of mandatory detention and offshore processing. So kind of skipping through some of this, essentially we've kind of had some backwards and forwards movement around offshore processing, offshore detention, but in terms of where things stand in 2025, we still have many asylum seekers on Nauru and a small amount remaining in Papua New Guinea, and at this point there's not really any pathway for them. There's no sense of what their future holds. There's no pathway for them to come to Australia, and equally resettlement deals that have been brokered with the US and New Zealand are in many cases kind of winding down. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future looks like. And although I know that asylum seeker issues are not necessarily in the news right now as much as they might have been 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's still an active issue, and these policies continue. So I've put a video here from a fantastic research centre at UNSW focusing on international refugee law, and just provides an overview of Australia's kind of offshore processing program, and provides a bit more information and detail to what I've just covered. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. It's embedded in the slides. And so when we think about who the asylum seekers are, and particularly if we think back to the kind of history of offshore processing that I've just discussed with you, we can see some of the real kind of concern around asylum seekers was kicked into overdrive in the year 2000, when there were many asylum seekers arriving from countries in the Middle East. And so I think when we consider asylum seekers and why they've attracted so much political kind of concern, I think it's inseparable from Islamophobia. And so if we're thinking about how to define Islamophobia, this remains quite a kind of contested question in academia. So lots of definitions have been critiqued for being simplistic or narrow, or focusing purely on kind of emotions such as fear and hatred. For instance, Allen argues that Islamophobia is not restricted to any specific action, practice, or discrimination, but is instead evident in a vast array of different social, political, and cultural processes, whereby the identification and recognition of Muslims and Islam as both other and problem are routinely consumed without question or contestation. So I think this is a really kind of useful statement, because again, it's showing how Muslims can be kind of constructed as other, and can be kind of uncritically or unreflexively positioned as being a problem. And how, if we're thinking about Islamophobia, we need to think about how it operates in a more kind of systematic, structural way, rather than trying to locate it in any one specific type of attitude or practice. So this is probably reminiscent for you of the distinction between individual and institutional forms of racism that we discussed a bit earlier in the lecture. So again, rather than having a kind of definition of Islamophobia based on individual attitudes or practices, it's potentially more useful or more useful, I'd say, to have one that's based on kind of structural and institutional systems. So drawing on some of the kind of research and literature on Islamophobia, an analysis of 349 reports of Islamophobia that was recorded over a 2-year period by a kind of Sydney-based specialist non-government organisation called Islamophobia Register highlighted that most of the Islamophobic attacks that they documented occurred in public spaces, and that women were vastly overrepresented as the targets of Islamophobia. So, when we're thinking about why women might be targeted, we can think about our discussion and analysis of intersectional forms of disadvantage. So maybe being Muslim and being a woman is kind of interacting in this certain way that is, creating this experience of hostility and discrimination that they're facing. And in a recent kind of large-scale survey amongst Australian Muslims, Rain and colleagues found that respondents' top 4 concerns were all related to some kind of manifestation of Islamophobia. So it could be the media portrayal of Islam and Muslims, discrimination against Muslims, anti-Islam sentiments in society, and right-wing terrorism. And in 2014, it was found that 1 in 4 Australians held a negative attitude towards Muslims, and that Muslims experience discrimination at 3 times the rate of other Australians. So again, we can see, I suppose, this being a kind of a case study of how racism can manifest, and it's also been found that representative population surveys have repeatedly found high levels of negative attitudes towards Muslims. So between kind of 25 and 40% of respondents often, holding kind of negative attitudes. So these attitudes aren't coming from nowhere. We can think about where they might be stemming from, and I think it's probably overly simplistic to say that they're coming from the media, but I think it might be more accurate to say that they are perpetuated by the media, or that the media is kind of normalizing certain ideas and ways of speaking about Muslims and Islam. So a range of media studies that have been conducted over the last 20 years or so have pretty consistently found that that Muslims and Islam are depicted in quite a biased way and associated with violence and terrorism. So, they're kind of stereotyped in a certain way and are not really depicted in a kind of normal and neutral way. And there's particularly quite a strong focus on Muslim women as oppressed and as kind of needing to be saved. So that's the general depictions that people are experiencing. And so we can also link some of these ideas about Muslims and Islam to cultural racism, which we discussed a bit earlier in the lecture. So according to the social theorist Tariq Madood, the basis of exclusion of the ethnic other in a Western state is determined by the extent to which a cultural group is seen as belonging. So when a moral panic about terrorism links fear of attack to Islam as a religion, this becomes a contemporary form of cultural racism. So what Madood is saying here is that, essentially, this kind of form of racism that's affecting Muslims within our society is stemming in large part from the fact that they're viewed as a kind of outside group or as an other, and this kind of othering process takes place due to the kind of moral panic associated with these links to terrorism, and this creates the sense that these individuals do not belong and not accepted within the wider cultural group, and therefore can be and should be excluded. And this is really borne out in the literature, which has found that there's a pretty significant kind of public fear of Islam and Muslims in Australia. So Broadbent found widespread support for the idea that Muslim Australians are potential terrorists. And this is despite the fact that Australia's seen only a very small number of cases and conviction of Islamist terrorism. So between 2001 and 2014, we had about 64 pieces of counter-terrorism legislation entered into Australian law. So this is maybe kind of showing a parallel to like the kind of relatively small numbers of asylum seekers arriving by boat and the enormous kind of expense and like legislative effort that went into managing that. And then we have something similar here. So relatively small numbers of kind of Islamist terrorists have actually been identified and convicted in the Australian context, and yet we have an enormous amount of kind of counter-terror legislation that's been created to combat this problem and address this fear. So we can see how this all contributes to a view of Muslims as like not fully kind of belonging within Australian society. So when we think about, how do we challenge Islamophobia? What can we do to kind of push back against this? So there's some research that we can draw on to do this. So research has found that Australian Muslims predominantly support the principle and practice of democracy. So, the idea that Australian Muslims want to undermine democracy and want to instate Sharia law is not true, and we have evidence that that's not true, and it's a kind of a cultural stereotype or a kind of discriminatory view that's not based in fact. And as Atty and Dunn point out, there's no compelling evidence in Australia to support the case for widespread radicalisation or vulnerability to radicalisation among Muslims, nor is there evidence to suggest widespread alienation. So if we compare Muslims to other social groups, there's not really evidence that shows that that Muslims are particularly radicalised or are particularly vulnerable to being radicalised when compared to the wider population. And I think we can maybe compare this to some of the recent concerns we've had around like right-wing extremism or fringe kind of movements or like lone wolf kind of actors, and think about why they haven't necessarily inspired the same level of kind of generalized anxiety. So obviously there's a lot of anxiety associated with the things that they've done, which are horrible, but there's not a sense of, oh well, what we need to do is do something about everyone that's in that identity group. We need to round up all of the white men and make sure they're not being radicalized. And so moving on to more of this data, a survey by Rain and colleagues found that Muslims both value their Islamic identity and actively seek to integrate into mainstream Australian society. So it seems, well, there's kind of negative media depictions that have, arguably kind of shaken many Muslim Australians' kind of confidence. They still have a really strong trust in healthcare, education, and the legal system. So this doesn't really paint a picture of a social group who are, struggling to integrate or are not willing to integrate or, are not part of mainstream Australian society at all. And so I think these studies really support the fact that, like all other Australians, Muslim people just want to kind of get on with their lives and make good lives for themselves and their families. So Moving on, that brings us right through to the end of our lecture. So just to quickly sum up some of what we've covered today, we can see that the concept of race is contested, and we can see that there's debate about the kind of biological reality of race, how we define race, but as sociologists, I'll reiterate, we're interested in how race is socially constructed and how it impacts the categories that we use to understand each other and impacts how people are treated. So that's really the focus of sociological analysis on race. And we can see as well that race and ethnicity have slightly different meanings. They're often used interchangeably in just general everyday conversation, but they are slightly different things. So race is arguably more fixed, although it still can change over kind of long periods of time because it is a socially constructed category. It's based on how we understand people's kind of physical attributes, whereas ethnicity is cultural. It's to do with practices. So race is more kind of how we appear and who we are, and ethnicity has a bit more to do with what we do. And so one of the most active spaces in which issues of race, ethnicity, and multiculturalism and belonging are discussed in contemporary Australia is in relation to asylum seekers. So we can see that over the last 35 years or so, there's been a lot of policy change and a lot of debate and a lot of public anxiety, and we can see so many of these ideas and concepts around race and ethnicity and kind of in-group, out-group distinctions that we've talked about earlier in the lecture really coming through here. And then finally, we can see that debates about asylum seekers are both kind of informed by but also reinforced by Islamophobia, but we can also see that this can be challenged through social science research. So this is one of the kind of wonderful things about social science and sociological research, that we can look at these kind of stereotypes and biases, and we can go out into the world and do research to see, are these actually accurate? Are these borne out in people's views and experiences? And we can challenge these kind of cultural ideas that don't necessarily have a very strong basis in people's everyday experiences and practices. So I'm going to leave this lecture here for today, but thank you so much for your time and attention, and I really hope you've enjoyed the material.